Okay, good morning, and thank you for attending. So, as Jeremy said, I'm going to be talking to you this morning about the Okavango repository for biodiversity data. So we did initially apply for a full grant from JRS last year, and they were interested in the project, but they didn't think that we were quite ready to get going with a full project. And they were definitely correct about that. So they offered us the opportunity to apply for a 6-month planning grant to basically set up networks, refine our ideas, make sure that we had partners in country who were supportive of the idea. So they provided us with some funding to run that in August, September last year. And we submitted our report at the beginning of this month. So the reason that we came up with a project to set up a repository is because biodiversity data in Botswana are not managed effectively. So there's a lot of loss of data. People coming into Botswana to collect data often take them with them when they leave, or they are stored either in paper format or on individual computers, and they're not shared. Data are not made accessible beyond the organization that actually collects them. So this means that we do have several repeats of studies that don't build on previous knowledge. They essentially start from scratch every time. Notably, communities that are asked for involvement in conservation projects are constantly asked to answer very similar questionnaires every few years, and they get very tired of that. We can end up with mixed messages from different bodies that are collecting data about similar topics, but without sharing. The data themselves don't get used for policies, for management decisions, particularly by government. So there's a distinct lack of evidence-based management. And that means that the government, when they're making decisions, could well be mismanaging resources, and that includes financial resources, human resources, and natural resources. There have been efforts to set up repositories in Botswana in the past, so we are running out of acronyms. There was the ORBIS, which is the Okavango Biodiversity Information System, and that was set up through proprietary software. It hasn't been updated. It's not really functioning. There are sort of some data sets available, but there's no recent additions to the database. Then we had the Okavango Delta Information System, ODIS, and that was open source software, but it was tied to a project which ended in 2015. And again, it hasn't really been promoted. Data aren't being updated or uploaded. So it's not really well known by data users or providers, and not really functioning. Then there was the Environmental Information System that was set up by the Department of Environmental Affairs, and it was supposed to be a repository for biodiversity data. But it seems that hasn't been used at all, probably for several years since the last data set was uploaded. And it was, a lot of these systems were sort of put in place, fully formed, without enough training, without actually engaging with stakeholders to work out what they needed, just sort of these repositories put in place, and then people were expected to use them, but without really knowing how or why. So none of these are really fully operational. None of them have updated information, and they all lacked this training component, the engagement, and they were just handed out to various agencies without dedicated staff to run them or motivate for them to be used. So that basically meant that there were low levels of buy-in and low sustainability, which is presumably why they're not operational now. So we still want to set up a repository for all biodiversity related data being collected in Botswana, with a focus on the Okavango Delta. As we know, GRS is focused on freshwater biodiversity, but we were told that based around the Okavango Delta, other information would also be relevant. So we've decided to engage with stakeholders from the very beginning, which is allowing us to identify the data sets that are most useful for stakeholders and decision makers and prioritize those. We want to set up a system with different access levels, and we'll come through to stakeholder reactions to those. We also want to have a link to existing data sets. So there is a GRS funding project at the Okavango Research Institute, which is where I'm based. There's also plans to set up a wildlife monitoring system for the Department of Wildlife and National Parks, which will be linked to wildlife sightings. And we want to make sure that any data that are being collected digitally can be linked to ORBIS, and that functionalities are targeted to stakeholder needs. So really what we want to set up is a sort of one-stop shop platform for all data users, collectors, so that everyone knows where to go to find data. So the stakeholder engagement aspect means that we've got a collaborative development of the project with defined priorities according to what they need. And we're making sure that stakeholders are fully cognizant and understanding of the entire project from the very start. One of the problems in Botswana is that a lot of people aren't really aware of the value of data and the importance of keeping data resources and making sure that they're accessible. So we're trying to also raise that awareness. We want to develop targeted progress goals, and through a sense of ownership and engagement in the project to develop the, to increase the sustainability of the project and try to make sure that it will carry on beyond even a full grant. So we've tried to develop an integrated implementation plan, which will obviously be improved upon once the grant starts, hopefully, if it's done. So we engaged with government departments, lots of acronyms here. So Department of Forestry and Range Resources, Department of Environmental Affairs, Department of National Museums and Monuments, Department of Wildlife and National Parks, and the Sustainable Development Goals Committee. We engaged with universities, so the University of Botswana, which the Okavango Research Institute falls under, and then the Botswana International University of Science and Technology, and one we've missed off there is the Botswana University of Agriculture and Natural Resources. We also engaged with parastatals, so Statistics Botswana is the official custodian of data in Botswana, so we made sure that we've been talking to them quite closely. We engaged with Okacom, which is the Permanent Commission for the Okavango River Basin. So they work in Namibia and Angola as well. We engaged with the private sector, so environmental consultants and safari operators. The latter are supposed to be involved in monitoring of large mammals through regular transects, so they collect data as well. And then with independent researchers and the NGOs. So we held 14 different meetings over 5 weeks in September, October, November. And found some, we requested that they give us information about what sort of data they currently collect and how they manage those data. What sort of data they really need, because some of these were data collectors, some of them were data users, some of them were both. The kind of functionalities that they would like ORBIS to have, how they would like to be trained in data management, because that was identified as a potential area that ORBIS should focus on, and any issues that they might have relating to data security and access. We were really, really pleasantly surprised by the level of interest in the project. It seemed to be coming at a really good time for most stakeholders who had sort of started to think about data but weren't really sure how to make things happen. It comes at the same time as the fourth industrial revolution, and Botswana wants to transition to a knowledge-based economy. So this is all in line with other developments. So all our stakeholders were very supportive, and essentially said that they understood very quickly that the project would be beneficial for them and would actually increase their work efficiency. So we didn't really have to sell the project. The stakeholders recognized the value straight away, which was really, really encouraging. And they recognized that the project could provide support for the commitments to international conventions like the Convention on Biological Diversity. The Okavango Delta is also part of is a Ramsar site and a World Heritage site. So there are reports needed for those conventions as well. So existing databases, the Department of National Museums and Monuments is digitizing their natural history collection. But there are delays that they were very frustrated by, and things don't seem to be moving that rapidly, which could well be just a lack of experience and a lack of understanding of how to do it. The herbarium at the University of Botswana and at ORI use the Brahms system, but that is proprietary software, and they have been struggling with finding people to help them with troubleshooting. So it's not necessarily sustainable if funds aren't available to pay for the license. We have the EvidenceBased, which I can't remember what it actually stands for, but that is essentially a library, University of Botswana library system that is supposed to handle all publications coming out of University of Botswana. But colleagues have reported that they have submitted publications over 2 years previously, and these have not been added to the system. So there are issues in updating there. The Okavango Research Institute monitoring data, which is the project I mentioned before, that's sponsored by JRS, funded by JRS, relates to environmental monitoring data. So it's information relating to temperatures, rainfall, water flow, water quality, those sort of things. We found that there was a massive lack of data management support at all universities. None of them have data management policies. None of them had facilities in which to store data. University of Botswana does have a high performance computing center, but it's not being used to its full capabilities, from what we understand. There is a digital support system for Okavango, which is the Permanent Commission for the Okavango River Basin, but that hasn't been fully developed yet. We did see some synergies, some overlaps, so we want to make sure that we're working with them as we develop the system and not duplicating efforts. There's also an NGO, the Wild Bird Trust, who basically run exploratory expeditions from Angola through to Botswana along the Okavango River and Kuito rivers, and they collect biodiversity data as they go. So these data are available online, but through speaking to people who have accessed them, the platform isn't very user-friendly, and most of the time people actually email the Wild Bird Trust managers directly for accessing data. So there isn't that much functioning in Botswana at the moment. We found that government particularly was still mostly recording information on paper, and current information is then digitized, but historical information has not been. Digitization leads to a lot of errors, a lot of inconsistency in terms that are being used, in spelling, even in the actual fields that are being populated. And that means that there's a low compatibility between data sets collected in different areas. So there's an example of problem animal control data, which I'll talk about a bit more later, but that's essentially data recorded from instances of human-wildlife conflict. And they're collected across Botswana and then brought to a central location, but every area collects them in a slightly different way. There were issues raised about how much space paper records occupy, which is quite wasteful, and often these records are not catalogued. So paper records are filed, but actually finding a record later on might be very tricky. There is a move towards digital records, particularly NGOs are using starting to use apps and so on to collect information. But then a lot of the time those data are kept on individual computers. NGOs are a lot better. Most of them were backing up, usually onto hard drives and sometimes onto the cloud. But most NGOs operate in areas with low connectivity. So hard drives are often an easier solution than the cloud. Other stakeholders, like universities, all the data was stored on individual computers. We do have OneDrive, so some people are using those to back up, but it was highlighted that those are all linked to passwords, and therefore if someone forgets their passwords, those data can be lost. Or if someone leaves the organization and takes the password with them, those data can be lost. So there's a big issue relating to individuals holding data rather than organizations. So at the moment, we put together a little map of the data to policy pathway, which is rather disjointed because we have a lot of observations on the left-hand side being collected, but then sometimes they're stored in hard copy. If they are uploaded to data sets, those are usually not linked. And so individual data contributors, organizations will produce individual reports, but they won't always submit their data to be used by the government. And it appears that the actual policies and official strategies that are produced are often influenced more by external conventions and documents than driven by the internal data. So we want to try and affect this as well. So stakeholders, when it comes to data priorities, they identified metadata as being really important, particularly about past and current research projects, so that information were available about who was doing what, where, and when, and who should be contacted about a new project that could build on a previous one. So this means that we could prevent the duplication of efforts and build on them rather than going over them again. So we wanted to provide, stakeholders suggested that we provide contact information, also links to publications, PDFs where possible, or at least DOIs if we couldn't get the PDFs themselves, and metadata about the data set, as well as about the project. And these metadata would be mostly open access. As we were discussing metadata and research projects in one of the meetings where we had several government representatives, there was a young man from Department of Environmental Affairs who used to work at Department of Wildlife and National Parks, and said that while he was at DWMP, he actually created a database for all of the research permits that included all of this information, who was studying what, where, searchable by keywords, searchable by region. But he left the department, I think around 2014 or 2015, and this information was not passed on. So we had the current regional head of research for wildlife in the room as well, and he was not aware that this database existed. So that's just an example of a lack of communication and sustainability of databases that rely on people rather than organizations. Stakeholders agreed that distribution and abundance would be priority information, and that they could be, most of the time, could be open access. Obviously, for protected species or vulnerable species, we would restrict that. The abundance can be really important for government reports and quotas, but there was an issue of some conflict of interest raised by some NGOs, so some NGOs are sponsored by funders that have political stances, particularly referring to trophy hunting, and could potentially retract funding if data from that NGO were used to provide a quota, hunting quota. So there were definite issues raised about access and attribution of data. GIS layers, spatial layers, remote sensing, that kind of thing were identified as being important. And several stakeholders mentioned that we should put the entire project into the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is why we met with the committee. The Department of Wildlife highlighted the problem animal control data. So these are, I mentioned them earlier, these are data collected in the context of human-wildlife conflict. So anytime that a wild animal is shot because of a conflict situation, or anytime that a wild animal, for example, a crop raids or a lion depredates livestock, then the information about the incident is recorded. And currently on paper, there's a lot of information recorded, but it is currently on paper, and then it's digitized. And as I mentioned before, that can lead to errors and lack of compatibility. So I've actually got a meeting later today to talk to someone about moving that to digital collection of the information, which would require training and a lot of motivation. But these data are actually used to then allocate compensation to people suffering from conflict. So, for example, a cow depredated by a lion receives, the owner of the cow would receive 100% compensation for that animal. But the compensation is often delayed and can be several years before people receive it. So there's a lot of negative feelings associated with these data, and a lot of pressure on the government to get them out. So they're not directly biodiversity data, but it is something that stakeholders have highlighted as a high priority. So we need to just consider that. There was, again, an example of, so that there were, I think, 7 years worth of problem animal control data were digitized with the help of an NGO up in Kasane for the Chobe area. And about a year later, the same NGO went to the department and found that there was a staff member that had been transcribing and digitizing the exact same data for the previous 6 months, and the head of the regional head had just changed and moved, and this information, this data set had not been transferred. So they wasted another 6 months just doing the exact same job again. So this is the kind of situation that we're dealing with. Stakeholders suggested that we also provide information about data quality, about the methods that we use to collect the data, and access to open source apps, tools that were used, and spreadsheets, again, if those were used. And they wanted data to be verifiable, replicable, and their quality to be accessible. With respect to the functionalities that stakeholders wanted, they wanted the ORBIS system to be interoperable with other existing systems like GBIF and iNaturalist, and that ORBIS could solicit updates from those external data sets regularly. They requested networking potential, so there could be a mailing group or a message board that could allow for people to communicate about data. That we could use the methods information to set up standardized protocols for different types of data collection to ease compatibility. And also that the system should be able to run in areas with low bandwidth, because our protected areas don't have any form of network connectivity, and most of the NGOs working out in even outside of protected areas are often in areas of low connectivity. Training was highlighted as one of the key areas that we needed to focus on, and it was important, basically essential for the program to be sustainable. We were recommended to run short-term data management courses as well as train the trainer courses, so that, for example, NGOs could be trained in data management courses that they could then pass on to stakeholders in their areas. We were also recommended to run long-term internships with particular individuals from stakeholders that could then return to their organization after an internship and act as champions to organize data uploading and teach people how to use the system. The Botswana Wildlife Training Institute was identified as a possible collaborator, because every Department of Wildlife officer goes through the BWTI prior to taking up their position. We have reached out to them. They haven't been very responsive, so we will need to follow up on that and see if we can incorporate data management into their curriculum. All stakeholders were concerned about data security and ownership. First, that the data would be protected physically and virtually, but over and above, their concern was about ownership, and that the data collector would be the data owner, and they would determine what access data users would have to their data. So we want to develop several different access levels. So, for example, if the data owner is okay with it, that some data obviously would be open access, and we would support that. But we do recognize that sometimes data owners need to publish from their data sets before making them accessible, or that some data might be sensitive. So we would need to go through some data sharing and use agreements. And several stakeholders suggested that we liaise with the Ministry of Environment to make sure that any research permit issued by them includes the stipulation that all data collected during the course of the project be uploaded to the ORBIS system, so that it is actually written into policy. So we suggested that open access, that data related to project and dataset metadata would be open access, as well as occurrence and, where possible, abundance data, but obviously not for protected species, particularly things like rhino, even elephant, that are under poaching pressure. That some data would be able to be visualized through maps or graphs, and then permission could be requested from the owner to actually download raw data. Sensitive data, including information about individuals, would not be visible. And then we would have several standard access levels, but the data owners could request those to be customized by ORBIS staff. And we would use embargo periods, firstly to allow people to publish from their data before making them accessible, but then also to try and set long-term limits on those restricted access, so that after, for example, 10 years after a project finishes, that those data automatically become open access, because most of the time if they aren't, then the data just sort of disappear and languish. The Department of Environmental Affairs suggested that we form a reference group with one representative per stakeholder on the group, and that they be kept updated with proposals, implementation plans, which we thought was a really good idea. And so we did send all of our reports to the reference groups for comment. And therefore, we hope that it would increase buy-in and sustainability and ensure that the stakeholders feel like they have input and ownership of the project. So we came up with a few use cases after interacting with stakeholders. So, for example, we thought government might need to prepare the reports on the biodiversity, so they would need access to occurrence and abundance data. And they should be able to have tailored outputs that meet their requirements and their standards. We thought researchers might need to harvest some data for analysis, and they particularly were interested in GIS layers and potentially historical data sets for comparisons. And we wanted to make sure that we had a DOI so that data were made citable for researchers. The private sector might need information for environmental impact assessments, for example. So they might need to know distributions for protected species and connecting into information from other databases. And then our last use case example, we thought that we wanted any member of the public interested in biodiversity in Botswana could access data sets, access maps, summary information about species occurrence. And that we would need to have a system that was user-friendly, intuitive, and could be used by lay people. So from the stakeholder engagements, we identified 3 key pillars for the project, which were the technical training and support for the stakeholders, the creation of a national infrastructure for the data, so ensure that there was support for data management, and then development of the actual system with the tools for data and metadata dissemination, exploration, and analysis. So we use these pillars to run a workshop for technical experts, and we developed a simple diagram about how we thought ORBIS might be able to use, that we asked the technical, that we presented to the technical workshop as well. So we thought the partners would feed data in to the system and receive training, and then the data could then go into a variety of types of repositories that would then go through tools to produce infographics, maps, to be used by data users. So this was just a simple conceptual design, and we then held a technical workshop at the beginning of December. And we managed to find a little break in COVID restrictions that allowed us to hold a hybrid session, hybrid workshop, where we had most people were present physically, and then we also had some virtual participants that were primarily international. So we invited representatives from the stakeholders with which we'd engaged, and we also asked widely for local, national technical experts that we could invite to join the workshop. So we started with a series of presentations from virtual and physical participants, and then we split the participants into groups for discussions around the 3 pillars that I presented just before. So we asked each group to focus on a different aspect of each pillar and provide feedback. So for the first pillar on technical training, The technical workshop participants recommended that we involve multiple institutions and that we design courses that can be provided by various stakeholders, not just by the University of Botswana or ORBIS. And they recommended that we target several levels of data management. So that includes at the data collector side, training people on the importance of consistency and standards and recording everything with the same spelling and recording the same information. But that we also needed to try and engage with higher level managers and even ministers to try and promote the idea of the importance of data, so that training would be supported and the value of data collection and management and analysis would be recognized throughout the stakeholder institutions. Participants suggested that we use the Darwin core standards for the biodiversity data and that we provide training in those, which has already happened to a certain extent through the previous JRS grant that was run by Mike Murray Hudson. They suggested that we run online and in-person training and that we offer refresher courses, because if people, often stakeholders indicated they thought some people were reluctant to adopt digital technology, mostly because they didn't really know enough about it. And so if there is a culture of reluctance, it's important to keep refreshing and keep promoting, so that people become less concerned and less wary of new things because they become more familiar. Participants suggested that we endorse the idea of identifying champions from different stakeholders and providing internships for them, and that throughout we should encourage transition to digital data for all the stakeholders. And that we provide support and curation through ORBIS. So we do envisage having a full-time data curator who would be responsible for data curation through ORBIS. So actually dedicated staff member to deal with all the data uploading and curation and checking and so on. With regards to the second pillar, there were recommendations that we should develop a national data management policy, which obviously means engaging at the highest level in ministries. And we have spoken to two deputy permanent secretaries about the project, and they were both supportive that this kind of high level policy needs to be driven by government. So we can just encourage rather than actually develop it ourselves. But at the moment, even if there's a development of a national data management policy, we don't currently have infrastructure to store data. So there are one of the collaborators on this project, Dr. Tsiamo Motsekwa. He runs the High Performance Computing Center at the University of Botswana, and he is engaging on very high levels with trying to bring Botswana up to date with technology and data. So he is much more up to speed with what's happening, and he does assure us that things are happening. But I think, as is true everywhere, these things will happen slowly. So participants suggested that we needed to have data quality checked and make sure that the data we were providing were well, from reputable sources and of reasonable quality. They agreed that we needed to have data ownership and access levels being clearly defined. And we did have a presentation from Helen Dallas from Freshwater Research Centre and from Tim Sutton from Cartesa on the FBIS, the Freshwater Biodiversity Information Service, System model. And all of the participants of the technical workshop were very impressed by EvidenceBased and were could envisage that a similar sort of system could apply to ORBIS. So they supported our that we engage with FRC and Cartosa as technical partners. Participants recommended that ORBIS be managed through the Okavango Research Institute because we have links to all the stakeholders, but we're not part of a government department. So the importance for us is really on data rather than on policies and outcomes. So we're less biased potentially than some other stakeholders. But there are other stakeholders that were very interested. So the University of Botswana Library Services were very interested in potentially taking over after an initial period, as were Statistics Botswana, who are the official custodians of data in Botswana. But both of those stakeholders indicated that they were interested, but that they would need extensive training before they would be comfortable in taking over a project. So we want to work with them. If we do get a full grant, we want to work closely, really closely with them to try and work out what the best route is for a sustainable project. Participants recommended that we host ORBIS in the cloud, but the issue was raised that we would need approval, permission from the government for that to happen, primarily because of issues relating to sovereignty. The third pillar on the system, participants, they were again very supportive of the EvidenceBased template, and they recommended that there be a spatial interface. They wanted that ORBIS would be able to handle multiple types of data from a variety of sources, that it be capable of generating maps and graphs, infographics that could be used for reports and information dissemination. They did request a light version for areas with limited connectivity, and it could make sense for that to be an app-based system, but that might be developed further down the line. So they also recommended that we have a phased implementation, that we focus on some priority data sets first, and then develop functionalities as we go. So with the idea of ORBIS, we have an updated proposed data policy pathway where we would actually form the central node for data, where we could include data from existing data sets like GBIF and iNaturalist, as well as incorporating data generated in Botswana and uploaded. Ideally, we could work with stakeholders to digitize legacy and historical data sets so that they could be added to the collection. And then we would provide access to all of these different types of data so that those could be used in generation of reports and particularly in policies and high-level documents. So we have proposed that we partner with Cartosa and FRC. Cartosa can provide the adaptation of their open source software to our requirements, and FRC have a lot of expertise in data mobilization, so we want to partner with them. We would like a full-time data curator to actually run the ORBIS system, and then a full-time PhD student who could develop additional functionalities, who could assist with training. And we also could have smaller projects for University of Botswana computer science students that are either doing masters or even on their undergraduate project, if they can just work on the system and develop some extra functionalities. The system is going to be based at ORI, or the staff members at least will be based at ORI. But we do want to investigate options for long-term sustainability beyond the 3-year, hopefully 3-year full project, to assess whether ORI is still the best hosting institution, or whether the system should be transferred to one of the other partners, such as Statistics Botswana, potentially. Kartoza is going to host the system during the development phase on their cloud, and during that phase we need to refine or confirm with the government as to whether they're happy for us to continue hosting on the cloud, or whether they will require physical servers in country. So we've developed an idea of the 3-tiered data modality system. So essentially a formal data model with existing functionalities in the biodiversity information management system developed by Kartoza. And these would produce standardized maps and graphs and so on, mostly relating to distribution and abundance. And then we would have an informal data model that could handle some different types of data. For example, at the moment, the BIM system can manage point-based data, but we also have trajectory-based data. So for example, from transects or aerial surveys, and those potentially could be incorporated into informal data model. And the output would be refined by the product owner and the person who actually needs the output. And then we also want to have a generic repository, so data would, in various formats, would just be uploaded and downloadable in the same formats without any summarization or graphical representation. So those would apply to things like GIS layers, shapefiles, or PDF documents of papers, for example, or even just CSV data sets relating to other types of information. So as I mentioned before, we completed our planning grant and we submitted the final report to JRS, and that was submitted on the 1st of this month. And they have indicated that the board will be meeting at the end of this month. And so we're now awaiting feedback, and we've been told that JRS is not issuing a call for proposals this year, but they will assess our project and then decide whether they want us to invite us to submit a full grant proposal. The report we submitted did include essentially a full grant proposal. So we tried to anticipate what they might want to know. So we are just waiting now and hoping that they will like what we've done. And that's it for me. So thank you very much.